It's time once again for Dialogue Conspiracy with political research specialist Mae Brussell, who for 5 years has shared with us her extensive research into political assassinations and abuses of power in this country. Her program relates the news of the week to emerging evidence about the conspiracy which allegedly maintains by force its control of the legislative, executive, and judicial processes in America. And now, Mae Brussell.
Good afternoon. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's Dialogue Conspiracy number 247, and the day is December the 20th, 1976. This is the last Monday of this year before Christmas. For those of you that celebrate Christmas or receive this tape later, just for the New Year's, Happy Christmas and Happy New Year from Mae Brussell in Carmel, California, to all of the listeners, loyal listeners that listen every week, and hopefully new ones that pick up each week as we go along. The subject I want to talk about today is Howard Hughes. That is a subject that has been very much in my mind for many, many years as I've done my research, and we've talked about various subjects the last few months, and I haven't spent one entire dialogue conspiracy on Howard Hughes, but I think we have to get up to date on the controversies and the wills and keep you informed on a few things that are happening with regard to the Howard Hughes case. Incidentally, if you want copies of the Playgirl article I did 2 years ago today with Stephanie Caruana, it was called Is Howard Hughes Dead and Buried Off a Greek Island? That was published in Playgirl, December 1974, and it's a very good article. I think it's very good. It's 2 years since we wrote it, and in those 2 years, and particularly since the Hughes body was cashed in Houston, Texas, that wasn't Howard Hughes, it makes that article even more meaningful every day. If you don't have a copy of that, or if you have one and lost it and you want another one, write to me and send a self-addressed envelope so that I don't have to bother with the stamping and addressing, and include 50 cents, and I'll send you a reprint of the article that was in Playgirl just 2 years ago, maintaining or alleging that Howard Hughes was buried in 1971 by Aristotle Onassis. And of course, this was written before that other body was turned over into Houston, Texas in 1975 in April. And I'm following the Hughes case very carefully to see just how accurate my research is, and watching the division of the wills and the legal arguments, because in those arguments is going to come the proof that Howard Hughes is not buried in Houston, Texas, and this is what I've been saying for a long time. There's another good book on Howard Hughes. It's called The Empire of Howard Hughes. It's written by Joe Davenport and Todd Lawson. And that book is $3 plus the postage. You can get copies of that. There's a bookstore in Capitola that carries that bookstore. The Aries Arts has The Empire of Howard Hughes, or you can write to me, and I have copies of that book. It's $3, and that's an excellent book on the Howard Hughes story. The used books are very hard to find. If you go to used bookstores, pick them up. If you don't want them, buy them for me and I'll pay you back. And if you go to garage sales or various places where used books are sold, buy any book that you can on Howard Hughes, and I'll be glad to reimburse you. And if I have it and you want to save it, save it for your children and yourself, because they are important books and they're very rare and they're not available. I just happened to walk into a SPCA shop that was raising money this week and found the book Hoax, which has been off the market. It's a book describing the Clifford Irving hoax and the allegations that Howard Hughes was helping him to write a book. So look around for used books and pick them up for me and for yourself wherever you can, and I'd appreciate that. Good Morning America this week had December the 15th, 1976, that's ABC television, had Robert Hartman on and Jack Anderson. And there was a gentleman on the show that has appeared or surfaced after several years who was a Howard Hughes double, and I mentioned his name in my article in Playgirl 2 years ago. His name is Brooks Randall, and Brooks Randall was interviewed on this show, and he described Howard Hughes as a very sensitive man. I have the cassette here. I may put it on the air in a few minutes and let you hear that part of the show, because many people missed it. It was early in the morning. Brooks Randall described Hughes as a very sensitive person who never used anybody, and if he ever let anybody go, he didn't want to fire them. He kept them on salary for life, the condition being that they wouldn't talk about Howard Hughes. And it was Brooks Randall who admitted that he doubled for Howard Hughes. He was hired by a Mike Chenard. His name is Mike Chenard, and he hired ex-FBI men or football players to guard Howard Hughes. And he claimed that he was a double for many, many years, along with a gentleman named Vance Cooper. And he also said that Howard Hughes had a great number of doubles, but particularly Vance Cooper was the voice of Howard Hughes more than Brooks Randall. Randall looked exactly like him. And so I think it was Mr. Hartman on Good Morning America that said, where is Vance Cooper now? And Brooks Randall said he's buried in Houston, Texas, that isn't Howard Hughes, that he's buried in Houston, Texas. So I believe I'll play that for you in a little while if we have time for you to hear him say that. He said that Howard Hughes kept an office, or many offices, and there were staffs, and then secretary and personnel assumed that they were working for Howard Hughes, and it actually was never used. They never saw Hughes in their life. And the use of a dead ringer for a voice and a dead ringer for a double, of course, demands that this body be taken out of the Houston grave and examined again, because I don't believe it's used. There are certain people like the governor of Nevada, Governor Callahan, who said he saw Howard Hughes in London in 1973, but there are already people working in the Hughes Corporation that say that the person in London was a double of Howard Hughes. Chester Davis, who became one of the heads of the Summa Corporation, Hughes Corporation, an attorney from New York, said he saw Howard Hughes once in 1973. This is coming out in a new book by James Phelan. But actually, Howard Hughes, who was not the man giving a radio telephone interview in 1972, this wasn't actually Howard Hughes either. It was the voice of Hughes, and at that time in 72, he said he was seeing Chester Davis regarding some legal matters, and yet in a new book coming out, Chester Davis says he saw him once in 73. The important thing on the Good Morning America show was that Attorney General John Hill was mentioned. Brooks Randall said that he not only believed that it wasn't Howard Hughes down in Texas, but the Attorney General of Texas doesn't believe Howard Hughes is buried in Houston, Texas. Now, if that is true, there certainly should be murder and kidnapping charges and forgery and many, many other charges against the Hughes Corporation and the people in charge. But then the great apologist of our century was on the air to counteract all that Brooks was saying, Jack Anderson. And Jack Anderson covering up the way he did on the John Kennedy assassination or the Robert Kennedy assassination or Martin Luther King or any of the major conspiracies. Jack Anderson comes in with a big broom and sweeps the truth under the rug, and he gets very anxious, and he says to Brooks Randall, well, I don't happen to agree with what you're saying. I got in touch with Mr. Simon of the Treasury immediately because I was interested in the Hughes case, and within 10 minutes he sent somebody down to fingerprint the body, and Mr. Kelly, the head of the FBI, personally processed those fingerprints, and it was Howard Hughes. And with that, the program ends, and they say, well, if you can find the Vance Cooper, let's find him, because one man is alleging that he's buried in Texas, and Jack Anderson is saying that Mr. Kelly of the FBI personally processed the fingerprints. Well, those of you that have been familiar with Dialogue Conspiracy for quite a while may recall that in 1975, in April, I wrote to Clarence Kelly of the FBI, and I asked him 5 questions. I said, who in Houston, Texas took the fingerprint off of the corpse that was identified as Howard Hughes, and which of your agents was present to observe the fingerprint being lifted? The 3rd question I asked him in correspondence was, who received the fingerprint in Washington, D.C., and 4th question was, who identified it and witnessed it as being made a comparison to a fingerprint of Howard Hughes? And 5, what document did you compare it to? And I got a letter from Clarence Kelly, director of the FBI, back to me directly saying, I'm satisfied that those are the fingerprints of Howard Hughes. And I wrote back and said, Mr. Kelly, remember the notorious FBI men that were involved in the cover-up of the Kennedy assassination? I want to know the names of the agents. We're not talking about the CIA. I was acting as if we weren't, but in this case it is the FBI and CIA combined. And I asked him, please give a name of these agents that identified the prints. And he wrote back to me and said, I don't have to tell you who they were. And he did not say, Mr. Kelly did not say positively that he identified those prints. And Jack Anderson said it was Mr. Kelly who did, and we have a tape cassette of that now, and I think it's important to get Mr. Kelly out of office. That's one thing you can do this week if you're not too busy with your Christmas. I see the Chief of Police, Ed Davis from Los Angeles, is asking Jimmy Carter to make Mr. Kelly, Clarence M. Kelly, the director of the FBI. Mr. Ed Davis is head of the president of the International Police, and he has asked, put pressure in Washington, D.C. He's back in Washington, D.C., and there was a meeting of the International Associations of Chiefs of Police, and he's pleading with Jimmy Carter to keep Mr. Kelly on the job. This is his quotation: "Attempting to sack Mr. Kelly prior to taking office makes it look like this is now going to be a political job." And he added that Congress did a wise thing in having a 10-year term, and that Mr. Kelly is a distinguished law enforcement official, and he defended him for the position. I think it's important to write to Jimmy Carter in Plains, Georgia, to the transition team, just say Jimmy Carter, transition team, Washington, D.C., or you have an office there, or in Plains, Georgia, and express your feelings, or better send a wire if you have the money, and point out, if you have the time or energy, that Mr. Kelly is a political appointment. He was appointed by Richard Nixon, who was appointed by Howard Hughes. There's a chain of command, there are vested interests, and it is also Ed Davis's private interest in keeping Mr. Kelly in there, because the Los Angeles Police Department, the Beverly Hills Police Department have been linked to the Howard Hughes case through these many, many years, perpetuating this hoax. And when these people should be on trial, such as a Nuremberg trial, for the things they did to this gentleman for perfectly obvious reasons, and all of them were money and power, it's time to not allow Mr. Kelly into the position of covering up. I called Good Morning America program immediately and spoke to the producers and said, how can you have Jack Anderson on a national show, and when will the major media quit lying to us? In fact, I told them I believe KLRB had the best news in the country going, because we get a different version of what the news is. But here's Jack Anderson telling us on national TV, no, that was Howard Hughes. And Jack Anderson worked 20 years, admittedly, with Frank Sturgis of the Watergate, who co-partnered with E. Howard Hunt, 21 years in the CIA. Both men have been in the CIA for years. Jack Anderson has worked with Frank Sturgis, and Hunt and Sturgis were receiving money for the Watergate burglary and other CIA operations through the Howard Hughes money at the Mullen Associates in Washington, D.C. So Howard Hughes money was going to Sturgis, who works with Jack Anderson. And furthermore, I claim that Jack Anderson has covered up other conflicts of interest, such as the fact that Clarence Kelly tells Jack Anderson, I fingerprinted the body of Hughes. Clarence Kelly was appointed as the director of the FBI by Richard Nixon, and Richard Nixon was selected in 1945 by Howard Hughes to become a president of the United States someday, and he directed his entire career from the time he was in the House of Representatives running against Jerry Voorhees, and then in the Senate against Helen Douglas, and then he was vice president, and the Hughes people were behind that. And when Richard Nixon lost the election to John Kennedy in 1960, with the help of the Howard Hughes people and various other agents, we had the assassination of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and a letter from the Hughes Corporation goes out saying, under our sponsorship, Richard Nixon can become president in '68, and he does. And they have sponsored everything the Nixons have wanted, and padded their money through skimming money of Vegas, and through B.B. Rebozo up through the White House, swimming pools and gifts for the children and houses for the daughter. Julie lived in a house that B.B. Rebozo owned in Washington, and all coming from Hughes funnel channel of money. So we have a conflict of interest here. Jack Anderson trying to deny the truth of what Brooks Randall is saying. And yet it's perfectly obvious to many people inside the Hughes organization that Howard Hughes was not alive up until April 1975. I had written to the Attorney General in July of 1976 when he was getting into this case, and told him to investigate a Dr. George Ward Thorne, the physician for Howard Hughes, and to check out with the medical records, the hospital officials, the dental charts, the descriptions of his diseases. And I went into forgeries at the time of Hughes selling TWA stock up to the time that he went into Mexico just before he died. The forgeries and the fingerprints have been going on as the Summa Corporation, and formerly the Hughes Tool Company, used Howard Hughes and used his name while this body was emaciated and drugged and kept in this terrible condition described similar to a person at Buchenwald. The Las Vegas Sun has a dynamic article which just came out last Sunday, December the 12th, the Sunday before this. It said, "Burn the Files," an order about Howard Hughes, and it's on Gerald Ford and Richard Nixon and the CIA. And there's a quotation of a gentleman that worked for Howard Hughes by the name of Johnny Meyer. And Johnny Meyer was able to get copies down in Mexico of 400 papers that were seized by the Mexican police when this body died down in Mexico. April 5th, 1975, the shredding machine began to go identical to the arrests at Watergate, and everything that the secretary aides were using was being shredded up very quickly. But the police came in and seized a pile of documents, and there were 4,000 documents. I said 400. The 4,000 of Hughes' most secret documents were kept and not destroyed. And among these documents was a note, for example, that they should destroy, the Hughes people should destroy our CIA relations, everything we have on Nixon, Gerald Ford, Senator Paul Lazault, that's the man that managed Ronald Reagan's campaign, and Nevada Governor Mike O'Callaghan. These were to be destroyed. Any CIA connections of Hughes to these people. Johnny Meyer lives in Vancouver, British Columbia, and he has the Hughes people have a lawsuit against him for overcharging for certain mines that they sold to him. So in retaliation for that, he sent a woman down to Mexico who got copies of these 4,000 documents, and I'll read some of the information here to you. But one of the things that Johnny Meyer said, and this is important, and it's important for my research and for all of us working into these various conspiracies. He said, "It is time the United States government moved in and took over the control of the Hughes empire in view of the material that was in the file." Actually, the United States government and Howard Hughes have been one since 1946, and Howard Hughes was a front for all the various conspiracies and crimes that the government couldn't legally do, but which the American people had no way to go in and investigate because of the various bookkeeping and the doubles and the secrecy of the Hughes organization. Under the guise that this poor man was bashful, he was kept drugged while all this mischief was going on. And the 4,000 documents that were available that Johnny Meyer now has in Canada are dynamite, and he claims that now it's time for the government to take over the whole organization. But that's too simple. Hughes always was the CIA, and we'll go into a little chronology of it, a review of it if we have time. But those 4,000 documents, if you keep your eyes open to the news, you'll be hearing more and more about the Hughes story. I said this about Lee Harvey Oswald as early as 1965, 11 years ago, 12 years ago, that Lee Harvey Oswald did not kill John Kennedy, and that you would see it in front of you more than even the Lincoln assassination because there's more news media coming out. In the same way, the Hughes story is just going to keep seeping and pouring and mix and blend with the Watergate and then combined with the various assassinations. It's the real story of a deceitful government at play, the United States government using every agency for conspiracy, forgery, murder, kidnapping, and dehydration of body and deception. I think the thing that makes me so angry is the general deception of the whole story. There was a gentleman on TV this morning whose book I've talked about, the new book, The File on the Tsar, and he was telling about, his name is Tony Summers, and he was telling about the documents that he got writing this book for 5 years that showed that the Tsar and the Tsarina and the 4 daughters and their son were alive, and they were not killed when the Russians took over at the time of the revolution. And the turning point in his research, he compared it to the John Kennedy assassination. The turning point of evidence was found at the Stanford Library, the Hoover Library, and at Harvard. And those are the two headquarters at the West Coast of Ronald Reagan and the Hughes people and Solzhenitsyn and the white Russian community. And in Harvard, it's Kissinger, Brzezinski, and the people running the Carter campaign. It's these people that are running our government from the time the Tsar was allowed to leave Russia and was still alive, and the deception then and the deception now is just continuous, and it's the same institutions and it's the same people and for the same purposes. And well, the main purpose is always this money and power. Well, getting back to the forgeries of Howard Hughes, because there is another name in the news this week, that poor, sad Dummar boy, Melvin Dummar, the big hero who was going to inherit $34 million. His name is in the news, but the same day that the courts were going to decide or start hearing testimony on whether or not that famous Howard Hughes will that was found in Salt Lake City was a hoax or not, the Nevada courts were going to hear it. And Noah Dietrich and some prominent handwriting experts were all lined up to say that it was an authentic will. It was supposed to be written in 1968, and it was found in Salt Lake City. And Melvin Dummar was to receive a large hunk of money. And just as they were investigating the background of Dummar and found that his fingerprints were on some books about Hughes that he said he hadn't read in the Life magazine article on Hughes, just the same week that the Dummar trouble was piling up, as the headlines, December the 14th, 1976, said, trouble piled up for Melvin Dummar. And December the 11th, 1976, the Nevada Sun, Las Vegas Sun, had an article that the Nevada Attorney General's office is investigating the possibility the so-called Mormon will may have been forged with the aids of documents that the Utah gas station operator Melvin Dummar had access to. Dummar had checked out these various books called Hoax from the Library in Utah. Well, December the 11th, 1976, Las Vegas Sun ran this article. The courts in Nevada were looking into this forged will. And halfway around the world, in another part of the world, a gentleman died, and I believe his death will be proven to be a murder and not a suicide at all, who could have written that forged will in Salt Lake City that was found in Salt Lake City. There were 3 deaths, as a matter of fact, this week that are related to cases in the headlines. I'll run them down briefly, but the important man is a man named Elmar, Elmyr de Hore. Elmar de Hore. He's the master forger. He's the greatest forger in the world. He died December the 11th, 1976, on Ibiza, Spain. It's a small island in Spain. He died the same week, the same day that the courts in Las Vegas were going to make a decision upon a massive $2 billion Howard Hughes will that was allegedly written in '68, and many experts claim it was forged. The recipient of the will would have included the Mormon Church, Noah Dietrich, who worked for 30 years for Howard Hughes, 30 to 40 years, this gas station attendant, Melvin Dummar, John Conley, who's been working for the CIA for many years, Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of the Navy, important part of the John Kennedy assassination, was in the office of the president of the Mormon Church when the will was found. And John Conley works with other agents such as Noah Dietrich's friend Gordon Novell. Gordon Novell is an acknowledged agent of the CIA who has Noah Dietrich, the recipient of this will, as the board of directors of several of his electronic corporations. The CIA is involved in this will, recipients of it, the planting of it, the location of it. And the same day that this will, the decision is going to be made of whether it's authentic or not, Dummar died. Well, who is Dummar? As I say, he's the master forger of all times. He died of what was supposed to be an overdose of barbiturates. The headline in the newspapers were that the art forger killed himself to avoid going to jail. He thought that he would die in jail if he were charged with falsifying these pictures, and he had been arrested. So he killed himself in order to save himself from being murdered in jail. That's the cover story. He was 65 years old, and he thought his life was in danger, so the article said he killed himself. There was one article about Dummar that came out when he died, and a quotation from Reuters News Service that said, in quotes, that he never forged a person's signature or document at any time. He said, "I never put someone else's signature on anything." But that's not true. Clifford Irving had written about his using names on documents. And the relationship of Clifford Irving to the Hughes organization and Dummar is very interesting. Now, all of this is important because Clifford Irving is a writer who lived on the island of Ibiza in Spain, lived in Carmel, California, Monterey for a while. His wife died down near Big Sur, near Esalen, an automobile crash, one of his many wives. He got to know this forger very well, this Elmyr de Hore. he wrote a book about him which was called Fake. As a matter of fact, Orson Welles made a movie on it. And after he had worked with him and wrote a book about his documenting or falsifying famous paintings in Europe, he went to work and wrote a book on Howard Hughes. In December, just 1971, this was 6 years ago, December 7th, 1971, McGraw-Hill had a press conference, 6 p.m. on Tuesday in New York City, and they had a 550-word news item that they're going to publish the biography of Howard Hughes, the official biography of Howard Hughes written by Clifford Irving. Now, Clifford Irving had to get a hold of some old yellow tablets that were supplied him by people inside the Hughes Corporation, and he wrote about Howard Hughes, and he had details of Hughes' life that were so close to Hughes' handwriting that some of the best handwriting experts in the world said that the book was authentic. In fact, Mr. Osborne, a well-known person for identifying handwriting, said that Hughes had written these documents, so that Clifford Irving had an insight into the Hughes people in some way. And without any doubt, for a long time they believed that Howard Hughes actually worked with Clifford Irving, and without any doubt the authorities who had access to handwriting experts believed that Hughes was seeing Clifford Irving. And just before Clifford Irving went to work on this particular story, as I say, he worked on a book called Fake. And nobody made the connection of the master artist, who he was in direct contact with, and the master forger, because he went on and wrote this biography. Now, Clifford Irving, we know, was getting information from someone inside and close to the Hughes organization. And when that book came out on Howard Hughes, the autobiography of Howard Hughes that Irving wrote, the allegations were made by James Phelan, the writer, that Clifford Irving took it from him, that information. Phelan's material on Howard Hughes was written up at length in Time magazine just the week before last, and he has a new book coming out on Howard Hughes that he calls the authentic book. But it's very interesting that if Clifford Irving took from James Phelan his material, that Phelan didn't sue him. And there was no lawsuit. Clifford Irving only went to jail for lying to McGraw-Hill and falsifying these documents for forgery at the time. But Phelan never sued Clifford Irving, which is interesting. If he took his material, he never sued him. And I had been informed through from various sources, one man in particular who had clued me off that Hughes had been buried in Greece, that Howard Hughes' Clifford Irving hoax was set up to promote the idea that Hughes was alive. You have to get the time chronology of the book that was going to be published in 1971 of Clifford Irving, right after he worked with the master forger, Dummar, over in Spain. Hughes was taken in 1970, November 70, from Las Vegas, and he was getting blood transfusions, and his hemoglobin was down to 4. He was half dead and skin and bones. And Robert Mayu, at that time, who was from the FBI and CIA and active in counterintelligence, ran the Hughes empire in Vegas, and he was swiftly dropped out of the Hughes organization, and Howard Hughes' body, or the double's body, was taken to the Bahamas. And there was a lot of talk that Hughes was, or that body, was actually a kidnapped victim and that was half dead or dying. So Robert Mayu sent his son down the Bahamas to try to get up to the hotel room and find out if this person was really alive or eating or how he was surviving. But at the time, there was so much controversy about the condition of this man that the staging would be perfect for Clifford Irving to come out with a book that would talk about Howard Hughes and give enough information that Howard Hughes would, in quotes, get angry. And this is where that double comes in that was mentioned on Good Morning America, who used the voice of Howard Hughes, the name of Howard Hughes, and the one that Brooks Randall thinks is buried in Texas. And then this double came on and called a news conference, a famous telephone conversation with 6 of the world's top newspaper people that were hand-picked. And he couldn't answer the questions. It was actually a disaster, and all the men were convinced it was used. But you hear from Brooks Randall that there was this fake voice. There was all over the place. There was this fake Hughes that even the secretaries didn't know they weren't working for Howard Hughes. So the important part of the Clifford Irving book was that by coming out with this book, it gave a chance for an indignant Hughes to get on the telephone in January 1972 and set the world to rest and Robert Mayu to rest and say, yes, This is Howard Hughes. This is the way it happened. Now, the important thing about this is that Howard Hughes was not in that hotel room, but the Clifford Irving hoax gave him the chance to say, this is Howard Hughes. The only person, getting back again to the Dummar story, here's this Melvin Dummar, and the only person who could have possibly forged that will in the Mormon will to make it even believable to 8 or 10 world experts would have to be the same person that wrote the Clifford Irving hoax that McGraw-Hill and Life magazine and Mr. Osborne and all these people said was the real thing that time. So I called the Attorney General, John Hill, in Texas, Houston, Texas, this afternoon, and spoke to the gentleman there in charge of the Hughes will. And I'm glad to be able to put this research to work. So I asked him, have you been reading about the death of Émile Duhory in Béziers, Spain? And he said, no, he wasn't keeping up with that. And I said, well, he is the master forger of all times. And if you subpoena the documents that Clifford Irving used at McGraw-Hill, get the original documents that he said Hughes wrote, and compare them to the Melvin Dummar will from 1968 that Howard Hughes was supposed to be written, you'll probably find the same ink and the same paper. Then you'll know that Duhory was murdered over in Spain on December the 11th, 1976, because the case of Dummar will was going to come up. And when it came down, they began to suspect it was a forgery. You see, everyone was getting suspicious because most of the Hughes experts knew that Hughes never left the hotel room in Las Vegas, Nevada. And first of all, after never having left, the second point, he wasn't there. So that there were enough people inside the Hughes organization that would know that there's no way that Dummar could give a lift to somebody along a road who was, his name is Dummar, D-U-M-M-A-R. He couldn't give somebody a lift along a road who was bleeding, who said he was Howard Hughes if Hughes never left the hotel room. So the suspicion turned to this young person, but you have to say, how would it be possible if Dummar did it? There's no way, there's absolutely no way to say how he got a hold of the yellow legal pads. Dummar would become a political patsy like Lee Harvey Oswald or James Earl Ray or Sirhan Sirhan, and the evidence would be planted and will be planted at his doorsteps. And yet a gas station attendant in a small town in Utah cannot read Life magazine or Clifford Irving's book Hoax and be able to document any handwriting or tablets or ink age that these experts wouldn't pick up in minutes. And furthermore, his fingerprints were on the envelope that was left at the Mormon church, but there's absolutely no way that he planted it, because in order to be in the room where John Conley was and the president of the Mormon church, everyone who was in that room or allowed to be there would be noticed that day or leave a name and be identified by some secret service. There's no way that this Melvin Dummar was in the office of the president of the church, the Mormon church, the day John Conley was there. So even if his fingerprints were on the envelope, he's going to be the patsy for this. And the very time that the Las Vegas courts and the experts were fighting over the will, and this nice little movie star, he was going to be the great one of a movie, Melvin Dummar story, the whole thing fell through. But the time that it fell through, Duhory was dead, and I believe he was murdered. And also on his lips, the remarks, he never left a note, but the remarks, he never copied a document, which is an outright lie. And that came over the Reuters news service. So they were supposed to make a movie, interestingly enough, Bo Goldman, the gentleman who won the Academy Award for One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest script, was to film the life of Dummar. It was to be called the Melvin Dummar story, $125 million movie. $125 million he would be left by Howard Hughes, and the movie was to be a $3 million production. He could even get as high as $37 million from the estate. And now the tune has changed, and he is suspected of serious crimes, and I don't believe that that young person did the forgery. Everything is piling up for him, but I think if we go halfway around the world, we'll find the links of the Howard Hughes people or Noah Dietrich and the CIA giving Duhory the story to write this, and then he died, and it's left in Salt Lake City. And if it went through, it would be fine, and if not, this little patsy is going to take the rap for the whole case. There were two other murders, or 3 or 4 happenings this week, I'll stay on the Hughes case, but I think they're interesting that the same day that the Horry died is the same time that they were investigating that phony will and deciding that it wasn't written by Howard Hughes in Salt Lake City. Also, last week I talked about that arms cache that was seized on Ontario, California. The Minutemen, the American Nazi Party, and the right-wing racist groups were stockpiling an arsenal, a small army in California. And there was a gentleman, Arthur Michael Methy, senior. He's 55 years old, and it was his property where a lot of this was being buried. He's the stepfather of 3 of these relatives who had stockpiled tons of buried ammunition. And he was taken by the sheriffs and picked up as one of the suspects, and he died about 20 feet away from the men in custody. They were standing back a safe distance if they wanted to actually give him a heart attack, and he dropped dead of a heart attack. And then the sheriffs down in Los Angeles or Riverside County said, in quotes, they ended their search and they're satisfied all weapons in the area were uncovered. Now that Mr. Methy is dead, I'm sure that they can say that his home was the last place and they covered all the weapons. But I think it's interesting that a man in the hands of these people in the custody of them drops dead, and then the case is closed and they say, we have all the arms we want. There's another murder case that took place December 19th. This was a great week for murders. I think the counterintelligence has to clean up their act, and they're doing a pretty good job of it. This involved a gentleman named Rick Manzi. You may or may not have seen about the murder. He's the husband of singer Barbara McNair. And there was an article in the San Francisco Chronicle this week, a large article, December 19th, 1976, Tax Shelter Schemes Put to the Court Test. And it describes it as one of the most important tax fraud cases in the history of the United States, perhaps the biggest breakthrough we've ever had in the whole area of fraud in the widespread use of offshore tax shelters. And this is an important case because the defense attorneys include Leo Bratton Jr., the attorney for Angela Davis, for her defense team. The man charged with various list of crimes is Harry Margolis. He has a 23-count indictment, and Margolis' former clients were Angela Davis, George Jackson, Harry Bridges, and some of the Hollywood 10. Margolis was obviously defending all of the so-called radical, a large number of them, who didn't fare very well, but he was representing them, and he's the defendant in this particular case. And one of the star witnesses in that case is to be singer Barbara McNair. And just at the time that she was getting to testify, this case is about to open, her husband was found dead in their Las Vegas apartment just last week. Always, or often, Las Vegas again, described as a gangland slang. So just at the time a woman is to testify at an important trial that involves somebody representing the most radical kinds of clients in this state or in the country, the husband of the woman to testify was murdered. Another person that was beat up and hurt this week was Truman Capote. He's still alive, but he had his front teeth knocked out and 15 stitches on his mouth, and he was knocked out, and then he flew to Florida shortly afterwards. He was in New York City in his home, and he's written a very controversial book, which hasn't hit the press yet. It's being held up, but he reveals a lot of the personal stories of people in Washington and New York City, high-up people who you're supposed to be able to recognize he's changed their names a little bit, but they're important, and I think it's important to know that these people do get roughed up. It doesn't matter how high or what. I'm sure that this is the dudes that they're scaring him or meant to hurt him badly and did knock out his teeth, and the book is supposed to be a bombshell. There also was in the Chronicle this morning an article about a new link of loan sharks and mafia moving in the same areas that I've studied, the Hughes mafia connections going from the East Coast in New Jersey, New York, and Las Vegas and Arizona. In California, the story is just breaking of the loan sharks and Meyer Lansky, all of J. Edgar Hoover's old pals, and Carlos Gambino is one of the people that's named in this new exposure that they're breaking. Gambino is the mafia boss who was supposed to have died from an overdose of the swine flu vaccine because they knew that he had a bad heart, so he was supposed to be given this swine flu purposely, and he died just before these exposures broke. So I'm sure as they unfold, they'll blame it on these dead mafia people. And as these trials are coming out and going before the courts, such as the tax shelter in San Francisco, the husband of a witness, or the gentleman caught with the arms cache murdered, and Dahori killed in Spain, and Truman Capote beat up, and Gambino felled purposely. You can see that the team that is holding the line to stop the interconnecting links of these various conspiracies are desperate, or they wouldn't speed up their escalations. These are similar to the assassination teams in Brazil and Argentina and Uruguay that are taking place right now, where hundreds of people are being killed, and in Chile too. In order to keep the government in the control of a few people, they're being knocked out very quickly and without much to do, and they go on to the next case. This happened in Nazi Germany. People were taken away and put in concentration camps and killed. And I just wonder, as I look at the scene domestically, what kind of response the American people can make to this kind of thing day after day. What is the appropriate response to these various deaths that are happening? I can't understand why so many people are complacent in light of witnesses that are going to testify, such as John Rosselli, who testified at the Senate committee and then was murdered several weeks afterwards, or Sam Giancana, who was about to testify and he was murdered, and William Harvey, who testified before Senator Church's committee on the CIA illegal activities, or he supplied the weapons that were going to kill Fidel Castro, and then he was murdered. And Sheffield Edwards, another gentleman that worked with the CIA, and Robert Mayhew, and John Rosselli and Sam Giancana, he was murdered. How many people, if you add it up, it's literally getting into the thousands. And I wonder how many people are going to respond to this in any way other than with complacence. I know that I was excited on Good Morning America to know that this Brooks Randall that I wrote about was saying that Howard Hughes was not buried in Texas, and the Attorney General in Texas knows it. And then I think, well, how slowly do you have to move? Why aren't people being arrested? Why doesn't that make the news service? How can you have this on Good Morning America and not have it in the Associated Press, United Press? Why can't they dig up this grave right away in Texas? Why can't the Attorney General, as the authority down there, just order that it be dug up and get to it? Or call in Mr. Kelly and make him sign a deposition on those fingerprints, and if they're not his, charge him with covering up a crime. Richard Nixon was taken out of office for covering up the crime of Watergate. And if this body that allegedly had its shoulder out of the bones, out of the collar, and a bleeding brain tumor, and down to 80 pounds, and emaciated, and obviously just shrunken and tortured, literally tortured, without any medication or nourishment or food, where it had access to any food, if this was not used and they allowed this emaciated body just to torture or experiment to happen, who is going to speak up for these people? Who is going to speak up and say what body was there? How did they get away with it? It's the biggest hoax of the century. We learned the hoax of, say, the Romanovs being alive and leaving the Soviet Union at the time of the revolution. Here's the case of Howard Hughes hoax, where a man's dead and they say he's alive where he's actually dead. I don't know, on a national program on TV, when these things are said, the newscaster just sort of smiles and passes it off, and that's a shame. Well, this is it for Dialogue Conspiracy. I think maybe next week I'll play you a retape. I have it here, and I didn't play it today, of the Good Morning America show. It's just 4 minutes long, where you can hear them describe the doubles of Howard Hughes. I'll put that on for you next week. I didn't have time this week. Have a good Christmas and a Happy New Year, and I'll see you on Dialogue Conspiracy next week.
This has been Dialogue Conspiracy with political research specialist Mae Brussell, who for many years has been researching the facts behind political assassinations and conspiracies in this country. Dialogue Conspiracy originates with KLRB FM in Carmel, California.